Would you open your Bibles to Mark chapter 14? Mark chapter 14. We continue working our way through the Passion narrative in the final hours in the life of our Lord. We're picking up the scene in Gethsemane. We're that close, early in the hours of Friday morning. And we'll be looking at verses 43 to 52. I've titled the sermon, "The Kiss of Death." Follow along with me as I read, starting in verse 43. And immediately while he was still speaking, Judas came, one of the 12, and with him a crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, "The one I will kiss is the man. Seize him and lead him away under guard." And when he came, he went up to him at once and said, "Rabbi," and he kissed him. And they laid hands on him and seized him. But one of those who stood by drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. And Jesus said to them, "Have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day I was with you in the temple, teaching, and you did not seize me. But let the scriptures be fulfilled." And they all left him and fled. And a young man followed him with nothing but a linen cloth about his body, and they seized him. But he left the linen cloth and ran away naked. Last Wednesday, January 20th, Inauguration Day, there were over 25,000 troops in the capital, D.C. 25,000. And to give you an idea of just how great that number of troops is, it's more than the combined presence the U.S. has currently in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria combined. Compared even to 4 years ago, there was about only 8,000 guardsmen. Troops, National Guardsmen, flown in and bussed in from all over the country. Flown in and bussed in from all over the country, heavily equipped with guns, with military equipment. They even brought in tanks. They fortified the Washington Mall area all the way as far back to the Capitol building, to the White House. They erected fences, just in case. There was checkpoints, security checkpoints to get in and out of the Capitol. You had to provide photo ID, and you had to provide proof of residence, or you weren't allowed in. All right, they spared no expense. Congress, that is. And the reason Congress did that is because of the insurrection that occurred 2 weeks prior on January 6th, as they called it, where some of the protesters who were protesting the Capitol swarmed it, broke through police barriers, broke into the Capitol building, broke some windows, took some pictures with statues, took Pelosi's podium, and the like. Hardly an insurrection by any sense of the term. Political revolution. And we should condemn, and rightfully do condemn, any sort of political violence, if we're consistent. That is wrong. It's sad that the actions of a few would do that. And particularly if it led to the loss of human life or physical violence, injury, and tragically it did, and particularly against the law authorities. That's tragic. But by no means an insurrection as far as what that word actually means, an armed political revolution. like many in the media and in the politics were calling it. An armed insurrection, though nobody in that crowd of hundreds of thousands of people actually had any firearms in the Capitol. But the point is, that event created a crippling fear in Congress. They were scared. They were so scared that something was going to happen on Inauguration Day, and so they spared no expense. Actually, our expense, our tax dollars, tens of millions of dollars invested to bring these 25,000 troops and expansive military equipment and fortifications to protect themselves from what they knew was surely coming, an insurrection. And Inauguration Day came. And as quickly as it came, it passed peacefully, without any violence, without any death at all. And of course it did. I think anyone in their right mind, any rational person would have expected just such a peaceful passing of transition in power. Especially since the outgoing president confirmed that. He said it's going to be a peaceful transition of power. And when I think about how irrational the fear was and how way above and beyond, unnecessarily, they went to take every precaution, busing in 25,000 troops just to make sure nothing happened, I can't help but think of Judas and the religious leadership here today in this scene in the garden in Mark 14, who also come to arrest Jesus with swords and with soldiers. I can't help but think of how completely out of touch they were with the reality of who Jesus is. A peaceful teacher, not a militant political revolutionary. He was far from it. And Judas, of all people, should have known that. Yet they came to arrest him with a show of military might, totally unnecessary in the case of Jesus. And they did it in the darkness of the night. No, Jesus was never going to fight back. His plan was never to retaliate. Jesus won't fight back because he knows he's on a divine mission and he's on a divine schedule. And we're going to keep seeing this as we have been already. He's saying, Judas, all of this is happening. You are handing me over to sinners, and you sinners are going to condemn me to death because this was always the predetermined plan of God and my mission to complete according to the Scriptures. According to the Scriptures. It's a rescue mission for which Jesus will complete only and once he gets to the cross and breathes his last and rises victorious on the third day. Nothing will stop him from completing this mission. That's what we're going to keep seeing here as we work through the narrative. And we're also going to see Jesus' incredible faithfulness and obedience in stunning contrast to the disciples, whose faithlessness and failure is on full display once again for us, as the prediction that Jesus has already made on their way to the garden, that they will all flee, now comes to fruition, and all of them will abandon him. Each and every one of them. Serves as a sobering reminder to you and to me, even on this side of the cross, that our faith can fail. And our faith will fail, as a point in fact, if we're not careful, in moments of intense testing and temptation. And so we need to see ourselves in the weaknesses and failures of the disciples, and then we need to set our eyes and our gaze on Christ as that perfect example of faith and obedience, to be motivated to follow in his footsteps. That's what we're going to look at. Starting in verse 43. By way of reminder, this whole section, the Passion narrative, is meant to be understood together as one story. Different scenes, but one story. And we saw it begin in chapter 14, right, when Jesus is anointed in Bethany. Then Judas' plot with the religious leaders to betray him. They have the Passover meal. The Passover meal ends. They go to the garden, and here we are today, continuing with that scene in the garden. And that entire night started on a somber note. The evening of the Passover meal, which was typically a joyful occasion, became an occasion of gloom and doom. Because Jesus said, one of you is going to betray me. Made even worse, after the meal ended, on the way to the garden, he says, you know what? Even though only one of you will betray me, the rest of you 11, you're all going to fall away too. And it sets a tone for the rest of the evening. He knows it's going to happen. He knows they're all going to fall away. Yet he asks them to come away with him to the garden to pray anyways, to watch, to strengthen themselves and to strengthen himself, knowing the horrors of the cross and of what lies ahead. And we saw Jesus' humanity on display like no other place in the Bible, didn't we, last week? As he pours out his heart before God, as he anticipates the horrors, not just physically of the cross, but spiritually of carrying the burden of the world's sin, when he knew no sin as God and had an eternal existence in perfect unity and relationship with God the Father, anticipating becoming sin and experiencing the full fury and weight of wrath that was due you and me in our place, and having the Father in that moment turn away from him on the cross and forsake him. It's a terrifying thought. It says he was deeply disturbed, he was distressed, he was anxious, he was shaking, trembling, falling down on his face before God, crying out with tears, sweating blood even. That's how intense it was. And in his humanity, in a moment of weakness, he contemplates, if at all possible, that this cup of suffering would pass from him. Yet he knows, as God, that this cup can't pass from him, that he must fully drink this cup, because it's the only way to rescue and to ransom sinners. And with the strength and resolve that only God and human flesh could have, he stands up, and he is resolved to meet and embrace his destiny head on as his betrayer is at hand. All the while, his disciples are asleep. Sleeping like babies, peacefully, without a worry or concern on their minds. Even though Jesus had warned them repeatedly about the betrayal, about the deception, about the denial, about the desertion that was at hand. And he finds them sleeping. And we saw that towards the end of the text last week. And he stands up, and he goes back to them, and he tells them, are you still asleep, Peter? You couldn't watch with me? You couldn't pray with me for 1 hour? And the rest of you, after you said you're willing to die with me? It's too late now. Up to your feet, he says. The hour has arrived, and my betrayer is at hand. And that's where we left off in verse 42. And now verse 43. Mark continues the story seamlessly, scene to scene. And immediately, while he was still speaking, Judas came, one of the 12, and with him a crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. Mark's emphasizing again, we know Judas is one of the 12. He said this repeatedly. The point is here, he really wants us to be gripped by the fact that this betrayal, this is the most treacherous form from one who was Jesus' closest companion on earth. This is the one who hands him over. One of the 12. And he comes with a crowd armed with swords and clubs. This is not a random, disorganized mob here. It says this is sanctioned by the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. That's the religious leadership of Israel right there, the Sanhedrin, whom we've been encountering since Jesus came into Jerusalem and was teaching in the temple and kept calling them out on their hypocrisy, which is why they're plotting to kill him. It's them who sanction this crowd, this mob. But it's not a disorganized mob of ordinary people. We know from Luke's account in chapter 22, he says, these are temple guards, officers of the temple. Not wild men, countrymen with pitchforks. These are trained, armed guards. And actually, in John's account, if you turn to John 18:12, he says this. It's not just the temple Jewish guards. He says it's a band of soldiers and their captain and the officers of the Jews arresting Jesus. That's two separate groups. You have the officers of the Jews, which is the temple guards, and then you have this band of soldiers with their captain. Who is that? That's a military term, by the way, for a captain there, that the Romans used to describe a tribune, a guy who had about 600 to 1,000 soldiers under his charge. And the word literally means a commander of 1,000 men, aptly named, because he had 1,000 men under him. There's some Roman soldiers here. Are you saying, Pastor, that there's 600, potentially 1,000 Romans there in that garden? No, I'm not saying that at all. What I am saying is, it wouldn't be surprising that there's some Roman presence here in the garden, especially during this time of Passover. It was a nationalistic holiday. It produced a lot of nationalistic sentiment and fervor. This is when most of the zealot uprising and rebellions had occurred. And Rome knew that. And so they'd normally have a cohort, several cohorts, stationed in Caesarea. And during the Passover, they'd send a cohort here just to keep the peace and to crush any rebellion should it occur. So I wouldn't be surprised if the Sanhedrin, before the garden here, went to Pilate, the governor of Judea, and said, hey, can we have a few extra soldiers? We have this prospective Messiah. He's got a big following. We want to find out what's going on. Sure, take these men with you. That's the idea. These are Jewish temple guards and deadly soldiers from Rome who are trained to capture and to kill. How many of them? I don't know, 20, 30, 40, 50. That would have been more than enough. More than enough to capture and to seize a bunch of fishermen. That's who's coming to Jesus. That's who Judas is bringing. And as they approach now, Judas makes sure that they don't miss the mark, that they don't capture the wrong guy. So he gives them a sign, verse 44. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, the one I will kiss is the man. Seize him and lead him away under guard. That's strange. But of all the signs he could have possibly given, why a kiss? Well, first of all, you need to understand, in that ancient society, without modern technology, they didn't have lampposts to light the roads ahead of them. And especially not in the countryside, in an obscure garden on a hillside. It was pitch black at night. You couldn't see anything unless you had a torch. And even if you had a torch, you couldn't see more than a few feet ahead of you. So it would have been very easy for them to get the wrong guy. There had to be a way to make sure that the guards knew exactly who to arrest. Not to mention the fact that a lot of these men probably didn't recognize Jesus. They couldn't tell him apart from the rest. That would have only been compounded by the darkness and increased the risk of them seizing the wrong guy. And they couldn't have that happen, right? They wouldn't take any chances. They had one shot. Well, that still doesn't really tell me and answer the question about why the kiss. It's still a weird signal. A kiss in that ancient Near Eastern society, much like today, was a type of greeting. The way you would greet someone with a sign of affection to show a level of closeness and relationship with them. The same thing as today. And one particularly between disciples and rabbis was showing respect and homage and affection. You'd come and you'd greet him, and you'd either kiss him on the cheek or you'd kiss him on the hand. I remember one story when I was in seminary. One of the professors, for a period of time, he was working as a missionary in Russia. And different cultures do it differently. You kiss out of respect on the cheek. So he was there. And in that culture of kind of old Baptist, old Pentecostals, they would kiss on the cheek, But it was only the men. So the men would kiss the men on the cheeks, and the women would kiss the women. And it took him a while to kind of get used to it, but still, especially being American, he wasn't really down with that. It's different. And especially if it's men who have bad oral hygiene. So he said there was always this one guy in particular, which he had to avoid like the plague, because that's exactly what his breath smelled like. So he would come into him, and he kind of learned to keep him away. He learned to stiff-arm him as soon as he made the approach and the greeting, so he just stiff-armed him, and he would dodge it. After a few weeks, the guy caught on, he said. And he managed, as soon as the guy stuck out his hand, he did like a side maneuver, pulled him in, and planted a big, juicy one right on his lips. They do it on the lips sometimes, too. And he was just, I remember him telling the story. It was hilarious. But that's the point. It was a sign of affection. And it actually became one to show the closeness of the early church believers in their unity in Christ and to one another. That's why Paul writes in 4 of his letters. He ends Romans. He ends 1st and 2nd Corinthians. He ends 1 Thessalonians. He says, greet one another with a holy kiss. And Peter says the same thing at the end of his first letter. He says, greet one another with a kiss of love. It's a sign of affection. Sign of affection. And actually, in that same context, I remember him telling another story. So he was having a meeting with a bunch of the men at the church, and he saw one guy leaning in to him, sitting beside him. So he kind of turned in. He thought the guy was trying to tell him something. He turned in to hear nothing. The guy didn't say anything. He looked kind of confused. Next meeting, same thing. Next meeting, same thing. The guy's leaning in, and so he leans in his ear. He thinks he wants to tell him something, to whisper in his ear. And then afterwards, a mutual friend who was there approached them, because that Russian man had approached him and said, what's wrong with this guy? Is he even a Christian? Is he even a brother? I keep trying to kiss him, but he doesn't let me. He keeps turning his face away. So he was trying to kiss him on the cheek. Sign of affection. They have the signal. The plan is in place. And now the time has come to execute the plan. Verse 45. And when he came, he went up to him at once and said, Rabbi, and he kissed him. You can just picture the scene in your mind here. He's approaching him. He's trying to be coy, inconspicuous, smiling. Don't worry about the 50 other soldiers behind me. This is nothing new. This is normal. Deceptively, Rabbi, Rabbi, he calls him. Again, as a way of identifying who it is. And he approaches him. And actually, in Luke's account, in chapter 22, he says, and Jesus knows exactly what Judas is doing. He knows what he's up to. And as he's approaching him and about to kiss him, he says, Judas, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss? Judas did indeed betray him with a kiss. The worst kind of a betrayal. It's like a stabbing in the back, right? He pulls him in to kiss him and plants a knife in his back. Like in the Old Testament, if you remember the story of Joab, where he pulls, what's his name? Amasa close. He pulls him close to kiss him. He grabs him by the beard to kiss him, and he has the dagger in the other hand, and he knifes him. The same kind of deception. And he kissed him, Mark says, verse 45. But this time, it's an intensified form of that same word kiss that we saw earlier. So the idea is kind of a passionate kiss, like on the cheek, keep, cheek to cheek, like we do it like that type of a thing. So there's no way the soldiers are going to miss who Jesus is to make sure they grab the right guy. And Matthew, in his account, after Judas kisses him, he looks at him and he says, friend, do what you came to do. My friend, my companion, the one whom I've invested and poured my life into for 3 years, who not only ate and drank with me, but ate and drank at the first communion with me. My friend, do what you came here to do. Do what you must do so that the scriptures about my betrayal come true. After the kiss, verse 46, and they laid hands on him and seized him. Judas gives them the signal. He looks at the guards, gives them the head nod, and they immediately grab Jesus by force. They grab him by force. And as they're grabbing him by force and all this commotion is happening, verse 47, but one of those who stood by drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. Wow. They're panicking. The disciples don't know what to do. Jesus is completely calm. He is poised. He is embracing his destiny. Someone standing by evidently grabs a sword in this commotion instinctively and impulsively and slices off the ear of Caiaphas, the high priest's servant, whom John in his story names Malchus. He cuts his ear clean off. Which means this guy was either really good with the sword or really bad with the sword. You've got to be very skilled and precise to swing like that and only take someone's ear off. Or miss badly the target. And do you know who this guy was that sliced off the ear? Mark doesn't tell us. It's not the purpose of his story from a narrative perspective. But John tells us in John 18:10, it was Peter. Impulsive, macho, brazen, bravado Peter. Now is the moment of truth, and he's going to put his money where his mouth is. And instinctively, with all the emotions he's feeling, fear, adrenaline, he reaches for the sword, he unsheathes it, and he swings full steam ahead as fast as he can and as hard as he can at the closest man to him, which happened to be Malchus, the high priest's servant. Peter was a fisherman. Which means you can bet he had no experience, no training in sword-to-sword combat at all. No skill with a sword. Which means Peter was dealing a death blow here. Peter tried to murder this man. And it was only because he was such a poor swordsman that he missed. Evidently, that the man must have ducked if he swung at him head on to split his head open, or perhaps like this to take it clean off. The man ducked and he ended up taking his ear. In an incredible twist of divine providence. Otherwise, he would have been a murderer. And imagine what would have happened to him then. They would have certainly seized him and crucified him with Jesus on the other side of the cross. But he missed. He only took off his ear. His right ear, Luke and John add, specifically. But that's courageous. He is starting to put his money where his mouth is, isn't it? You said, wow, Peter, there's hope for you after all. Right? Is that what Jesus said? Was he impressed? Oh my goodness, Peter, wow, there is yet hope for you. Maybe you won't deny me 3 times after all. Maybe you won't run away in fear and in cowardice. Is that what he said? That's not what he said. In Matthew 26, he immediately turns to Peter and said, Peter, what are you doing? Put away your sword. Don't you know that those who live by the sword will die by the sword? And here he's echoing the first command from God, the first recognition from God in the Bible in Genesis 9:6 about the value and the dignity and the sanctity of human life, which is made in God's image. He says, whoever sheds man's blood, Genesis 9:6, by man will his blood be shed because man is made in the image of God. And actually that was further codified in Exodus 21:22-24. The lex talionis, right? The eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth principle, which is somewhat related. And do you know in what context God gives that codification in the Mosaic Old Testament law in Exodus 21:22? It's a context of two men fighting. They're fighting. And he says, if in the middle of your fighting, you accidentally strike a woman who's pregnant with a child, if the woman and the child are okay, then the man who hit her must pay a price, an appropriate price to her husband. But if the woman or the baby or both die, that man is to be put to death. Even if you kill a baby accidentally, the penalty was death. Which shows how much God values life in the womb, and that he indeed believes that human life made in the image of God starts at conception and grows in the womb and is just as precious and as valuable and as sacred as life outside of the womb, yes. But it also shows just how egregious of a sin it is to murder a baby in God's eyes. It's an abomination. Jesus says, Peter, put away your sword. You don't want to do that, Peter. Not to mention, it's completely unnecessary. You know what else he says in Matthew 26:53? He says, Peter, this is futility. Don't you understand that all I have to do is snap my finger and ask the Father, and he's going to send to me 12 legions of angels to slaughter my enemies? That's all I have to do. Wow, 12 legions of angels? Do you know how many that is? There's about 6,000 soldiers in a Roman legion. 6,000, and Jesus has more than 12 legions, times at least 12, which is 72,000 angels. That is a serious show of military might. Because you know what one angel is capable of? Do you remember what one angel did in 2 Kings 19? Slaughtered 185,000 Assyrians when their king Sennacherib tried to lead them to take and to conquer Jerusalem. One angel. Imagine what 72,000 could do. So Jesus says, Peter, what are you doing? Don't you remember what I've been telling you this whole time? I am the good shepherd, and I lay my life down for my sheep. I do it willingly. Nobody has the authority to take it from me. I have the authority to lay it down, and I'm doing it to rescue you. For the Son of Man came to serve, and not to be served, but to give his life a ransom for many. This is why I came, Peter. I've told you 3 times I'm going to be opposed, rejected, and handed over to men to die. But I'm the one who's handing over my life. I lay it down willingly. Nobody's going to take it from me unless I surrender. And I am fully surrendered to the will and the purpose of God for my life, because it means salvation for the world. And that's what he's going to do. Salvation for the world. And you know what's amazing? Luke, of course Luke, the physician, he's the one who records this detail. He records this detail. Chapter 22, he says, in an incredible act of compassion and mercy, even on his enemies, those who were there to arrest him for the purposes of killing him, because he touches the man's ear and heals him. I don't know, does that mean when Peter swung, he only sliced off a part of his ear, or the whole thing, or part of it, so he just had a little orejita, as they say in Spanish? And I only learned that word because there were some cookies in the kitchen the one day. And right on the cover it said orejitas on it. And I was reminded of a dear friend of mine who's also a member of this church, faithful servant, and he has little ears, so I started calling him orejitas. So I don't know if he just had a little piece missing and Jesus touched it and created it anew, or it was the whole thing. But the point is, Jesus, the Son of God and creator of the universe, used his creative powers. He had mercy on his enemy. He touched his ear, and he created one brand new. Incredible. Incredible to think that, yes, Jesus came down to lay down his life for his sheep, for his friends. He says, no, there is no greater love than for a man to lay down his life for his friends. But he also came to lay down his life for sinners, for his enemies, rather. And the reality that all of us are born into sin, even you and me, on this side of the cross, even now that we believe, we are all sinners, which means we're all enemies of God from birth, let alone every other sin that we've committed against God and continue to commit against God every single day. That's what Paul says in Romans 5:10. We were all enemies of God. Everybody was. Before Christ. But Christ reconciled us to God, he says. He reconciled us to God because he alone paid sin's penalty on the cross as a substitute in the place of his enemies, which are sinners like you and me. And because he rose on the third day victorious, God vindicated him and confirmed that his death, his sacrifice, atoned for the sins in our place and satisfied the righteous requirements of God's law. Because of that, Paul says in Romans 5:1, we now have peace with God in Christ Jesus. We're no longer enemies. Friends. Or sons, his daughters. Jesus can't understand why they come at him with such an unnecessary show of force. Because he knows he's going according to the predetermined plan of God. He was never going to put up a fight. He was always going to go peacefully, resolved with the courage and the bravery of the Son of God. That's partially why he answers, as he answers here in verse 48. And Jesus said to them, have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But let the scriptures be fulfilled. I have no idea why you've come at me like this. You had every opportunity this entire week, day after day, teaching in the temple. You've heard what I've been saying. My kingdom is not of this world. I'm not militant. I'm not violent. I've done nothing but heal. I've done nothing but restore. I've done nothing but pray. I've done nothing but bring and preach a message of peace. And you're coming to arrest me with soldiers and with swords as I'm some sort of robber, he says. And that word robber, it's that same word used to describe the two thieves on either side of him on the cross. And it can mean that, but it actually was used to describe zealots, political revolutionaries. Like Barabbas, the zealot who participated in a recent uprising and rebellion, and so he was in prison, and actually he was a murderer, it says. That's a zealot. The guy whom the crowd would choose to be released even over Jesus. He's saying, are you coming at me like this? Is this what you've made of me? Judas, you of all people should know. You've been with me for 3 years. And even the rest of you don't have an excuse. You're coming at me like I'm some sort of violent, zealous, militant murderer? But I know why you came at me like this. You came at me like this here and now in the darkness of the night in a garden 2 miles outside of the city walls because you were too afraid to seize me when I was in the temple. Because you knew the crowds still embraced me and looked upon me with favor and with awe and with reverence, and you didn't want that. So you waited. Schemed. You connived. Together with one of my closest friends to find my whereabouts in a moment where I wouldn't be suspecting it, in the middle of the night, in this garden, under the cover of darkness. That's why you're doing this. And you don't even realize this, but you're doing this to fulfill scriptures. And that's an incredible irony here, is that Judas and the religious leaders think they are in control of Jesus' destiny and his fate. They are in control. They're going to arrest him. They're going to kill him. And they have no idea that this is all happening according to God's plan. Jesus knows that. He's not fazed by that. And that's why he goes so peacefully and bravely, with full courage and conviction and resolve. He says, but let the scriptures be fulfilled. What scripture was he talking about here in mind? It could be Luke's. In Luke's story, as they're making their way to the garden, they're talking, and Jesus says, something's going to happen. It's going to fulfill the scripture so that this one, and he quotes Isaiah 53:12, says so that he was numbered with the transgressors. And Isaiah 53 is that great suffering servant Messiah passage that describes the one who would be crushed for our iniquities, whom God would slay in our place, and who would make many righteous. But in verse 12 he says he'll be numbered with the transgressors, carry the sin of many. Numbered with, counted as, considered as. And so here you have the religious leaders and Judas coming to seize him and arrest him as though he's a transgressor, a criminal, a thief, robber. But I also think it's another passage that Jesus had in mind. And it's a passage he's already alluded to earlier in the garden, actually on their way to the garden, when he said they're all going to abandon him. Zechariah 13:7, strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. I think that's what he had in mind, because that's exactly what happens. Look at verse 50. They all left him and fled. All of them. It's commotion, it's a frenzy, they're fearful, they don't know what to do. They see the Roman soldiers. It's persecution, it's imprisonment, it's death. They don't know what lays ahead, but they want no part of it, and they beeline it. All of them. All who said they would follow Jesus to death now desert him. Every single one of them. Peter and the rest of them. And as shocking as that is, we need to remember that in the garden, Jesus had given them one command. He had asked them to watch, which means to pray with him. And they didn't do that. In fact, they slept instead. And because they slept in the moment of trial and of testing and of temptation, they failed miserably. And you have to wonder, what would have happened if they did what Jesus asked them to? If in those moments, in those hours in the garden, they prayed with him? Would the outcome have been different? Would they have followed him and been arrested with him? Can't say for certain. But what we can do is see ourselves and put ourselves in the shoes of the disciples and apply this to our own situation. Knowing the immense and intense difficulty of certain trials and testing and temptations in life, and how easy it is to make the wrong choice and to do the wrong thing, especially without divine enablement. And how do we get divine enablement? Pray. And that's the point here. To sleep means not to pray. Sleeping is the opposite of watchfulness, which means it's the opposite of prayer, because watchfulness is prayer. Being ready. And we don't pray because oftentimes we don't even realize we're in a trial. Our trial is impending. It's just around the corner. We're oblivious to it. We're unaware. Spiritually, our eyes are groggy. We're tired. We're lackadaisical. And then the trial falls upon us quickly, and before we know it, we're neck deep, barely keeping head above the water. like the disciples. And we don't pray because we think we're strong enough. We have enough spiritual strength and bravado, like Peter and the rest of them. Or we think we can do it. We don't need prayer. God, I got this. No, I'm okay on my own. I have enough of what it takes. I don't need to constantly be in prayer, asking you for divine strength and enablement and power and grace. No, I don't need that. I got this on my own. And then what happens? If we don't ask for it, he's not going to give it. And if he's not going to give it, we're inevitably going to fall and fail, which we've seen as a pattern from our own experience, haven't we? Again and again and again. Whenever I rely on my own strength, I fail miserably. The disciples had a choice to make. It was fight or flight. And we know they chose flight. And for them, there was a very real prospect of imprisonment and potentially even death if they were to stay and follow Jesus. They who actually said they would, not too long ago, if you remember in Mark 10, after the rich young ruler, he wasn't willing to part with his wealth and what he had, and he leaves sadly, and he turns away. And Peter says, hey, we've left everything for you, Jesus. We left our families, we left our jobs, we left everything to follow you. And yet in the moment of a very real fiery trial and test, they disavow their discipleship and refuse to follow Jesus into it. Because they weren't watchful. And oftentimes, following Jesus does mean persecution and death. It has throughout church history from the very beginning. Countless Christians have followed Jesus into death and paid the ultimate price as martyrs. The question is, would you be willing to follow him into death? Would you be willing to die for your faith? Would you be willing to die for Jesus if push came to shove? Because people are still dying for Jesus and for their faith even today in parts of the world. I know we haven't experienced it here yet. Christians are dying for Jesus today in Saudi Arabia, in Iran, in Pakistan, being slaughtered by Muslims in those countries because of their profession of faith. Hindus are slaughtering Christians in India because of their faith in Jesus. Christians are being killed in China and in North Korea under the heavy hand and boot of communism today. And make no mistake, it's going to come even here, sooner or later. Sooner than later, probably. If you look at the direction this country's heading by recently elected officials and knowing their values and their hostilities towards the gospel and towards the biblical Christian worldview, you can bet it's coming. Maybe even in our lifetime. The question is, will we be ready? How are we going to respond when it does? Are we going to follow Jesus into death? Into glory? Into his kingdom? Are we going to run away in fear like the disciples? And the answer to that question depends largely on how watchful, which is to say how prayerful we are now ahead of time, asking for divine enablement and grace to get us through to that hour or whatever trial lies ahead. That's the key. And then this scene comes to an end as part of this larger story on a very obscure note. On an obscure note of the first recorded streaker in history. Verse 51. And a young man followed him with nothing but a linen cloth about his body. And they seized him. But he left the linen cloth and ran away naked. There have been a lot of interpretations about just what this passage means and the identity of this young man. And I can tell you with full confidence that they are all nothing more than sheer speculation and conjecture. Because Mark's the only evangelist out of the four that records this. We know nothing more about this man. There's been some fanciful theories. One is, this young man is actually Mark, John Mark, the author of the gospel, and this is his way of subtly inserting himself, sort of putting his stamp of authenticity on this gospel, because it's sort of like this. Well, only an eyewitness who was there would be able to know such a detail. And that theory is made even more outlandish by certain suggestions. They say, so what happened was this. Remember, John Mark is the son of Mary, an early faithful Christians who had that house in Acts 12:12 in Jerusalem where the early church would come and worship and pray. And so that must have been the house that the Last Supper occurred in. And this was Mark who just followed Jesus and the rest into the garden after the Last Supper because he was there, and so it must be John Mark. And to that I say, I can't prove it either way, yes or no. I have no idea who it is. Nobody has any idea who it is. Don't ask me. I'm kidding. No, who is it? Who is this guy? Probably a random guy, young man, who was in nearby Bethany. Remember, Bethany was close to the garden, 2 miles outside. Or Jerusalem. He got awakened in the middle of the night by all the commotion. Perhaps he heard Judas and all the soldiers and the guards. They were making noise. There was torches. They were marching. There were swords. And his curiosity got the best of him. So he just jumps out of bed, and instead of putting on his tunic, which was the outer garment, you'd put it on, over your neck, and it would take a little longer. Maybe he just grabbed the bed sheet and wrapped himself in it that he was sleeping in, and he's following curiously. And he makes it all the way to the garden with them, and he's hiding in the bushes, and he sees the commotion happening. He's frightened, eyes wide open. What is going on here? As everything starts to take place, the guard sees Jesus. The disciples split. They beeline it past him. And suddenly the guards are chasing them, and they notice this guy hiding in the bushes. He's hiding in the bushes. And they start running towards him, so he starts running away. And as he starts running away for his life, they reach out and grab him. And as they do, they only grab the sheet, and he just lets it go and books it naked, streaking all the way back to Bethany. That's the best explanation I got. But whatever his identity, it doesn't matter. It can't let us miss the greater point which is oozing through this entire passage, through this whole narrative, through all of Jesus' life. And it's that he is completely in control of his destiny. He willingly submits to the Father, and he delivers himself over to the religious leaders. Fulfill the plan and the purpose of God for his life and the Scriptures. So he delivers himself over to sinners, while he also delivers himself over for sinners. Bow with me as we close in prayer.